Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 46, The American Civil War, Part 3. Fortunate Son is a song by the Creedence Clearwater Revival released on their fourth solo album in November 1969. It soon became an anti-war movement anthem and a graphic symbol of the counterculture's resistance to the U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War and the solidarity with the soldiers fighting it. CCR's lead singer John Fogerty says he based the lyrics on, quote, the old saying about rich men making war and poor men having to fight them, end quote. The song has broadly featured in pop culture portrayals of the Vietnam War and the anti-war crusade. Harkening back to our rhyming analogy from George Lucas, we can pull very similar correlations between that song and the American Civil War. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no senator's son. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no fortunate one. War has been waged by the poor and minorities throughout history. This has become an almost inescapable lens to view the world from. So too does the American Civil War need such a treatment. Growing up, I consumed media, especially between binge sessions of video games. One movie that I watched often was a VHS copy of 1989's Glory. It's a historical war drama film about the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the Union Army's earliest African-American regiments in the Civil War. It stars Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington, Carey Hughes, and Morgan Freeman as members of the 54th in their heroic actions at the Second Battle of Fort Wagner. This tale profoundly affected me. It was one of the first depictions of the dichotomy of war to your humble narrator. To me, this is not something as superficial as representation in media, but rather an accurate portrayal of what minorities have been dealt within the United States. Despite their absence from American textbook, this country has been watered in the spilled blood of blacks, Asians, women, and homosexuals, and they deserve a headstone like the rest of the fallen.
African Americans and the Civil War. Tens of thousands of enslaved African Americans of all ages escaped to Union lines for freedom. Contraband camps were set up in some areas, where blacks started discovering to read and write. Others traversed with the Union Army. By the war's end, more than 180,000 African Americans, mainly from the South, battled with the Union Army and Navy as U.S. colored troops and sailors. Contraband was typically used in the United States military during the American Civil War to define a new status for individual escaped enslaved people or those affiliated with Union forces. They used many laborers to sustain Union efforts and soon began to pay them earnings. The formerly enslaved people set up camps near Union forces, and the Army permitted support and educate adults and children among the refugees. Thousands of men from these camps enlisted in the United States colored troops when recruitment started in 1863. At war's end, more than 100 contraband camps existed in the South, including the Freedmen's Colony of Roanoke Island, where 3,500 formerly enslaved people operated to develop an autonomous society. The status of Southern-owned enslaved people after Confederate states had engaged in the American Civil War became an issue early in 1861, not long after hostilities began. At Fort Monroe in Virginia's Hampton Roads, Major General Benjamin Butler, commander, learned that 3 enslaved people had made their way across Hampton Roads Harbor from Confederate-occupied Norfolk County and delivered themselves at Union-held Fort Monroe. General Butler declined to return the fled enslaved people to slaveholders who defended the Confederacy. This amounted to categorizing them as contraband, although another officer's first use of that terminology in military records appears to have been. The 3 enslaved people, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory, had been leased by their masters to the Confederate Army to help construct defense batteries at Sewell's Point, across the mouth of Hampton Roads from the Union-held Fort Monroe. They escaped at night and rowed a boat to Old Point Comfort, pursuing asylum at Fort Monroe. Before the war, the owners of the enslaved people would have been legally entitled to request their return and likely would have done so under the federal 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. But Virginia had announced that it no longer was part of the United States. Because the practice virtually acknowledged the seceded states as foreign entities, President Abraham Lincoln disapproved of it. General Butler, familiarized as an attorney, believed that if Virginia thought itself a foreign power to the U.S., he was under no duty to return the 3 men, he would hold them as contraband of war. Butler denied the request when Confederate Major John B. Carey demanded their return. General Butler did not pay the escaped slaves wages for work they began to embark on, and he continued to refer to them as enslaved people. On September 25, 1861, the Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles administered to give persons of color in the hire of the Union Navy pay at the rate of $10 per month and a full day's ration. 3 weeks later, the Union Army followed suit, paying male contrabands at Fort Monroe $8 a month and females $4, distinctive to that command. In August, the U.S. Congress passed the Confiscation Act of 1861, which declared that any property used by the Confederate military, including enslaved people, could be seized by Union forces. The following March, its act prohibiting the return of slaves prohibited returning enslaved people to Confederate enslavers or the military. The word spread fast among southeastern Virginia's slave societies. While becoming a contraband did not mean total autonomy, many enslaved people believed it a step. After Butler's conclusion, many more escaped enslaved people found their way to Fort Monroe and pleaded to become contraband. As the number of formerly enslaved people grew too large to be accommodated inside the fort, the contrabands pitched housing outside the congested base from the burned ruins of the city of Hampton. They called their new settlement Grand Contraband Camp. By the end of the war in April 1865, less than 4 years later, a calculated 10,000 escaped enslaved people had applied to gain contraband status, with many living nearby. Across the South, Union forces managed more than 100 contraband camps, although not all were as large. From a base on Roanoke Island that started in 1862, Horace James formed the Freedmen's Colony of Roanoke Island. Established by the Union Army, James was a congregational chaplain who, with the freedmen, tried to create a self-sufficient colony on the island. Near Fort Monroe, but beyond its protective walls, the pioneering teacher Mary S. Peake taught adult and child contrabands to read and write. She was the first black teacher employed by the American Missionary Association, sending multiple northern white teachers to the South to teach. This area of Elizabeth City County later became part of the campus of Hampton University, a historically black college. Defying a Virginia law against educating enslaved people, Peake and other teachers held classes outdoors under a large oak tree. In 1863, President Lincoln read the Emancipation Proclamation to the contrabands and free blacks there, for which the tree was named the Emancipation Oak. For most contrabands, total emancipation did not occur until the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution repealing slavery was confirmed in late 1865. On July 18, 1863, the Second Battle of Fort Wagner began when the 54th Regiment Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, an African-American military unit led by white Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, attacked a Confederate fort at Morris Island, South Carolina. The attack on Fort Wagner by the 54th Regiment Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry failed to take the defense, and Gould was slain in the battle. However, the Confederates relinquished the fort on September 7, 1863, after many could not stand the continuous weeks of bombardment and the smell of dead Union black soldiers thickening them. About 1,515 Union soldiers were killed, caught, or wounded in the assault of July 18, although this number has never been accurately documented. General Haggard, the commander of Fort Wagner on the morning of July 19, stated in his report to General P.G.T. Beauregard that he buried 800 bodies in mass graves in front of Wagner. Only 315 men were left from the 54th after the battle. 30 were killed in action, including Colonel Shaw and Captains Russell and Simpkins, and buried together in a single grave. 24 later died of wounds, 15 were captured, and 52 were reported missing after the battle and never seen again. The men of the 54th Massachusetts were hailed for their bravery. William Carney, An African American sergeant with the 54th is considered the first black recipient of the Medal of Honor for his actions that day in retrieving and returning the unit's U.S. flag to Union lines. Their conduct enhanced the prominence of African Americans as soldiers, leading to greater Union recruitment of African Americans, which boosted the Northern states' numerical advantage. In addition, the South recognized for the first time that captured African American soldiers were to be treated as enemy combatants and not prisoners. Confederate casualties numbered 174. A portrayal of the battle is the climax of the 1989 film Glory.
Women and the Civil War. At the start, Southern women supported men going off to war. They saw the men as guardians and imbued laboriously in the utopian idea of men fighting to protect the integrity of their land, household, and way of life. Mothers and wives could reach their loved ones who had chosen to enlist by writing them letters. On the other hand, African American women had encountered the breakup of families for years and were again dealing with this matter at the outburst of war. During the American Civil War, Dorothea Dix served as the Union's superintendent of female nurses. She led all female nurses working in Army hospitals, which were over 3,000 nurses. Dix set policies for nurse candidates. Enlistees were to be aged 35 to 50 and plain-looking. They had to wear unhooped black or brown dresses with no jewelry or cosmetics. Dix wanted to bypass dispatching vulnerable, beautiful young women into the hospitals, where she worried the men would manipulate them. Dix often fired volunteer nurses she hadn't personally prepared or hired. At odds with Army doctors, Dix feuded with them over managing medical facilities and hiring and dismissing nurses. Many doctors and surgeons did not want any female nurses in their hospitals. To solve the dilemma, the War Department introduced Order No. 351 in October 1863. It gave the Surgeon General and the Superintendent of Army Nurses the power to appoint female nurses. However, it gave doctors the authority to allocate employees and volunteers to hospitals, clearing Dix of direct operational accountability. As superintendent, Dix directed the Federal Army Nursing Program, in which over 3,000 women would ultimately serve. Meanwhile, her influence was eclipsed by other notable women such as Dr. Mary Edwards Walker and Clara Barton. She quit in August 1865 and later believed this bout in her career a letdown. Although thousands of Catholic nuns successfully functioned as army nurses, Dix questioned them. Her anti-Catholicism damaged her working ability with Irish and German nuns. But her even-handed caring for Union and Confederate wounded alike assured her memory in the South. Her nurses often provided the only care known in the field to Confederate wounded. When Confederate forces withdrew from Gettysburg, they left behind 5,000 injured soldiers. These were treated by many of Dix's nurses. Peers well respected her work throughout the war because of her devotion. This arose from her putting aside her earlier work to concentrate fully on the fight. With the close of the war, peers acknowledged her service formally. She was granted 2 national flags for the care, succor, and relief of the sick and wounded soldiers of the United States on the battlefield, in camps and hospitals during the recent war. Dix eventually founded 32 hospitals and influenced the creation of 2 others in Japan. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker functioned as assistant surgeon with General Burnside's Union forces in 1862 and an Ohio regiment in East Tennessee the following year. Walker volunteered at the eruption of the American Civil War as a surgeon, first for the Army but was declined because she was a woman. She was offered the nurse role but refused and chose to volunteer as a civilian surgeon for the Union Army. The U.S. Army had no female surgeons. At first, she was permitted to practice only as a nurse. She served at the First Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861, and at the Patent Office Hospital in Washington, D.C. She worked as an unpaid field surgeon near Union front lines, including at the Battle of Fredericksburg and Chattanooga after Chickamauga. As a suffragist, she was pleased to see women performing as soldiers and alerted the press to the case of Frances Hook in Ward II of the Chattanooga Hospital. This woman served in the Union forces camouflaged as a man. Walker was the first female surgeon in the Union Army. She wore men's clothing during her work, claiming it to be more manageable for the high demands of her work. In September 1862, Walker wrote to the War Department requesting employment as a spy, but officials rejected her proposition. In September 1863, she was employed as a contract acting assistant surgeon by the Army of the Cumberland, becoming the first female surgeon operated by the U.S. Army surgeon. Walker was later designated assistant surgeon of the 52nd Ohio Infantry. During her service, she often crossed battle lines and treated civilians. On April 10, 1864, she was apprehended by Confederate troops and charged as a spy just after helping a Confederate doctor execute an amputation. She was sent to Castle Thunder in Richmond, Virginia, and stayed there until August 12, 1864, as part of a prisoner exchange. While imprisoned, she declined to wear the clothes she supplied, said to be more becoming of her sex. Walker was exchanged for a Confederate surgeon from Tennessee on August 12, 1864. She served as director of a female prison in Louisville, Kentucky, and as the head of an orphanage in Tennessee. After the war, President Andrew Johnson granted her the Medal of Honor, making her the only woman to receive the United States' highest military honor. On April 2, 1863, in the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, about 5,000 people, mostly poor women, smashed into shops and began taking food, clothing, shoes, and even jewelry before the militia arrived to restore order. Tens of thousands of dollars worth of items were looted. No one died, and a few were wounded. The riot was arranged and prompted by Mary Jackson, a peddler and the mother of a soldier. President Jefferson Davis implored the women and even threw them money from his pockets, asking them to dissipate. The mayor read the riot act, the governor called out the militia and restored order. The work practices of privileged white women modified radically after the Civil War, depending on their stage in the life cycle. Women over 50 changed least, insisting they needed servants and resuming their formal administrative roles. The next generation, containing the young wives and mothers during the Civil War, relied much less on black servants, and displayed greater flexibility toward household work. The youngest generation, which matured during the war and Reconstruction, did many of their domestic duties. Some sought paid jobs outside the household, especially teaching, which allowed an escape from household assignments and coerced marriage. About 250,000 Southern soldiers never came home, or 30% of all white men aged 18 to 40 in 1860. Widows who were devastated often deserted the farm and integrated into the households of relatives or even became refugees living in camps with high rates of disease and death. They were an old maid who unsettled the women and their families of the Old South. Now it has become almost a benchmark. Some women received the liberty of not having to marry. Divorce, while never entirely tolerated, became more common. The new woman notion appeared. She was self-sufficient and autonomous and stood in sharp distinction from the Southern belle of antebellum myth.
Asian Americans and the Civil War. Approximately 70 Chinese and Filipinos enlisted in the Union Army and Navy during the American Civil War. Smaller numbers serve in the armed forces of the Confederate States of America. Of those who did, only a handful received the honor of their pension, benefits, or citizenship service. An anomaly was Ching Lee, who took the alias Thomas Sylvanus and served in the 81st Pennsylvania Regiment. Thomas Sylvanus, a citizen of Hong Kong, was a highly decorated veteran of the Civil War. He was the only Chinese soldier to draw a Civil War pension. Little is known about Sylvanus's early life or parentage. Born on July 4, 1845, in Hong Kong, he was known in his youth as Or Yi Wei. After he was orphaned, officials put him in the care of a Mrs. McClintock, who intended to familiarize him with the United States and send him back to China as a preacher. She turned ill, so she turned him over to Dr. Sylvanus Mills. Dr. Mills then placed the boy in the care of his sister, Mary Duval of Baltimore. He took the Sylvanus surname and his first name, Thomas, from a sailor who had been kind to him. Unfortunately, Mrs. Duval treated Sylvanus as a household enslaved person. The Civil War provided him with a means of escape from the Duval home. He managed to get to Philadelphia, where he enlisted in Company D of the 81st Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. He was discharged due to disability but re-enlisted in the 51st Regiment Company D. He also served as a draftee reserve in the 42nd New York Volunteer Infantry. Sylvanus saw combat in the Civil War's bloodiest battles, the 7 Days, Richmond, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. Wounded at Cold Harbor, he was seized and detained in the infamous Andersonville prison, where he contracted a disease that impaired his vision. Joseph Pierce was brought to the U.S. from China by his adoptive father, Connecticut ship captain, and the Far East trader Amos Peck. Pierce enlisted on July 26, 1862, and was summoned into the 14th Regiment, Company F of the Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. Pierce earned the highest rank of any Chinese American to serve in the Union Army, attaining the rank of corporal. From 1862 to 1865, Pierce fought in pivotal war battles, battling ineffectual campaigns from Antietam to Gettysburg to Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Pierce's picture hangs in the Gettysburg Museum. Edward Day Coulter was born in Shanghai, China, and was adopted by the captain of the merchant ship Coulter, Sergeant S. Day. He served in the 23rd Massachusetts Infantry during the American Civil War. After the war, he rejoined the Army and served for 30 years. Coulter thought he was a U.S. citizen after serving in the Union Army. Still, his service had not automatically granted citizenship upon him, and the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 kept him from becoming a naturalized citizen. Chiang and Eng Bunker were Siamese-American conjoined twin brothers whose fame drove the phrase Siamese twins to become interchangeable with conjoined twins. They were widely displayed as novelties and were two of the 19th century's most studied human beings. In today's Thailand, the brothers were born of Chinese ancestry and were brought to the United States in 1829. Physicians examined them as they became known to American and European audiences in freak shows. In early exhibitions, they appeared exotic and portrayed their athleticism. Later on, they would hold conversations in English in a more distinguished parlor setting. Newspapers and the public were originally compassionate to them, and within 3 years, they left the control of their managers, who they thought were defrauding them, and traveled on their own. The twins quit touring in 1839 after a decade of financial success and settled near Mount Airy, North Carolina. They became American citizens, married local sisters, and bought enslaved people. They fathered 21 children, several of whom chaperoned them once they continued touring. Chiang's and Eng's families lived in 2 separate houses, taking alternating 3-day stays. The twins became wealthy businessmen but lost part of their wealth and enslaved people after the Civil War. They died at age 62, and an autopsy indicated that their livers were fused in the ligament, joining their sternums. Christopher Wren Bunker and his brother Stephen Bunker, Chiang and Eng Bunker's eldest sons, joined different Confederate cavalry units. During the Civil War, the North Carolina's Bunker family backed the Confederacy, including giving Confederate soldiers medical aid. In 1864, Christopher Wren Bunker was captured and sent to Camp Chase.
Muslims and the Civil War. While many minority groups have acknowledged their contributions and achievements during the Civil War, one group of Americans has received little attention. Muslim Americans are rarely the focus of Civil War scholars and are typically viewed as a demographic relevant only to more modern history. It has been theorized that as many as 292 Muslim last names appear in muster rolls. Further, as many as 15% of enslaved Africans brought to America are thought to have practiced Islam. While these summary statistics supply an overview of Muslim American involvement in the Civil War era, their personal stories show their significance in shaping America. Haji Ali, an Ottoman camel driver, anchored in Indianola, Texas, aboard the USS Supply in 1856. Conscripted by the U.S. government, he was to partake in one of the oddest military experiments in the pre-Civil War era. A year earlier, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis persuaded Congress to create the Camel Military Corps to patrol the recently obtained lands in the desert Southwest. When the camels arrived from the Ottoman Empire, locals met them with wonder and awe. The U.S. soldiers appointed to the new Camel Corps were equally baffled and could not handle the alien creatures. Enter Haji Ali, nicknamed Hi Jolly by his American companions. Hi Jolly lived on and became a local legend along with the dozens of camels that wandered the Southwest for years. The first mission for the Camels was to bring Lieutenant Edward Beale on an excursion, probing for a potential southern route for the Transcontinental Railroad. Sadly, and certainly ironically, given the mastermind behind the creation of the Corps was the reviled CSA President Jefferson Davis, the Civil War flitted any hopes for the future of the Camel Corps. Muslims and the religion of Islam were considered significant in the abolishment of slavery. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, famous for his caning on the Senate floor at the hands of South Carolina Senator Preston Brooks, even quoted the Quran on several occurrences during his orations bashing slavery. While not alive during the Civil War, Senegal-born slave Ayuba Suleiman Diallo played an important role in revealing the atrocities of slavery in his many slave records. In 1864, New England abolitionist Theodore Dwight used Diallo's story for an article titled Condition and Character of Negroes in Africa. Penned only a year after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Diallo's story's republication was instrumental in convincing Northern public opinion to get behind the war to obliterate slavery from the American landscape. Other Muslims also helped endorse the end of slavery. In 1864, Hussein Pasha, Tunisian general and president of the Tunis Municipal Council, sent a letter to United States Secretary of State William Seward calling on the United States to stop slavery in the name of humanity. The letter sparked a correspondence between the Tunisian and United States governments and was ultimately enclosed in a list of critical executive documents printed by the House of Representatives. Some previously enslaved people even fought to end slavery in the service of the United States colored troops. One such was Muhammad Ali Ben Said, also known as Nicholas Said. Said was born in the Kingdom of Bornu, found in present-day Libya, Chad, and Sudan, and enslaved after being abducted as a teenager. Serving Arab, Turkish, and Russian masters, he journeyed the world before emancipating in England in 1859. Said traveled to Canada and worked as a servant before entering the United States in 1862 and becoming a teacher in Detroit, Michigan. Said enlisted as a private in Company I, 55th Massachusetts Infantry, the following year. Said and the 55th Massachusetts fought in the battles of James Island and Honey Hill. After the war, he settled in the South and started schools for black children during Reconstruction. Estimations varying from a dozen to 292 Muslims served in the Union military during the American Civil War, including Private Muhammad Khan. The highest-ranking Muslim officer in the Union Army was Captain Moses Osman. He was born in Persia, raised in Afghanistan, and resettled in the United States. Another Muslim soldier from the Civil War was Max Hassan, an African who labored for the military as a porter. During the American Civil War, the scorched earth policy of the North destroyed churches, farms, schools, libraries, colleges, and many other properties. The libraries at the University of Alabama managed to save one book from the debris of their library buildings. On the morning of April 4, 1865, when federal troops reached the campus with an order to eradicate the university, André Dielfra, a modern language professor and caretaker of the library, pleaded to the commanding officer to spare one of the finest libraries in the South. The officer, being compassionate, sent a courier to General Croxton at his headquarters in Tuscaloosa asking permission to save the rotunda, but the general refused to allow this. The officer said, "I will save one volume as a memento of this occasion." The volume chosen was a rare copy of the Quran.
Jews in the Civil War. Roughly 3,000 Jews fought on the Confederate side during the American Civil War, and 7,000 fought on the Union side. Jews also played leadership roles on both sides, with 9 Jewish generals serving in the Union Army. The most famous were Brigadier Generals Edward Solomon and Frederick Knfka. There were also 21 Jewish colonels who fought for the Union, including Marcus M. Spiegel of Ohio, and Max Friedman, who oversaw the 65th Pennsylvania Regiment, 5th Cavalry, known as Cameron's Dragoons, had a sizable number of German Jewish immigrants from Philadelphia in its ranks. Several dozens of Jewish officers also fought for the Confederacy, most notably Colonel Abraham Charles Myers, a West Point graduate and Quartermaster General of the Confederate Army. Several Jewish bankers played vital roles in supplying government financing for both sides of the Civil War, the Speyer and Seligman family for the Union and Emil Erlanger and Company for the Confederacy. The Civil War split Jews as it did all Americans. Southern Jews backed the Confederacy, Northern Jews preferred the Union. Before the war, Jews never took a general mindset on slavery. Although many shared anti-slavery opinions, they viewed the Christian-oriented abolitionist movement with suspicion. Two vocal Jewish abolitionists were Ernestine Rose and Rabbi David Einhorn. Rose, a Polish immigrant, was a popular lecturer and a frank supporter of women's rights. "Emancipation from every kind of bondage is my principle," she exclaimed. Einhorn used his pulpit and journal, Sinai, to preach, "Jews must fight bigotry since Jews have consciously or unconsciously fought for the freedom of conscience for thousands of years." Yet some Jews held other views on the slavery issue. Rabbi Morris Raphall of New York's congregation B'nai Yeshurun was a melodramatic lecturer and writer. He was the first Jewish clergyman to give an opening prayer for a session of the United States Congress on February 1, 1860. Rabbi Einhorn was aghast and forcefully rebutted Raphall's words in Sinai. He delivered a widely reprinted sermon, A Bible View of Slavery. Many were disappointed with his words. Southerners viewed them with satisfaction. "Slavery has existed since the earliest time," the rabbi wrote. "Slaveholding is no sin," he asserted, since slave property is expressly placed under the protection of the Ten Commandments. Thousands of Jews volunteered, and many died on both sides of the conflict. An estimate by Congressman Simon Wolfe placed the number in the Union forces at about 8,400 and in the Confederate forces at about 10,000. Other estimates differ, but Jews fought on both sides in numbers greater than their percentage in the general population. There were 9 Jewish generals in the North and several in the South. Jews fought not only for their respective causes but also for equal treatment for themselves. 6 Jewish soldiers in the Union Army received the coveted Congressional Medal of Honor for their bravery. Jewish soldiers returned to their homes to rebuild their country and lives when the war ended.
Homosexuality in the Civil War. Civil War historians have argued about the number of gay and lesbian service members during the war. Some would say that none were dishonorably discharged, although there is a record of 3 pairs of Navy sailors court-martialed for improper and indecent intercourse with each other. The Richmond Dispatch reported on May 13, 1862, that since the moving of the Confederacy's capital to Richmond, that, quote, "loose males of the most abandoned character from other parts of the Confederacy," end quote, had moved to Richmond, and the prostitutes of both sexes openly exhibited themselves in carriages and on sidewalks. Before the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, gay service members were discharged under honorable conditions called fraudulent enlistment. Who were gay service members and who weren't in the American Civil War is a tricky question, since the word homosexual and heterosexual weren't part of the American dictionary until 30 years after the war ended. Regardless, not having a word like homosexual during the Civil War to describe same-sex attraction among soldiers does not nullify its use to define them today. Using archival records such as court-martial and medical documents, newspaper articles, pornographic books and cards, and letters and diaries of the soldiers, historians focus on addressing the issue of prostitution, straight and gay, and why both the Union and Confederate armies had to work to stop sexually transmitted infections from disabling their soldiers because sickness was costing more in soldiers' health and lives than action on the battlefield. During the Civil War, traditional gender roles and sexual behavior could not be strictly tethered to a heterosexual paradigm. Men outnumbered women, particularly at social events like dances. Drummer boys, or children as young as 9 and 10 years old, dressed in drag. One historian references a ball by a Massachusetts regiment stationed in Virginia in 1864 about young drummer boys dressed as women. Alphonse Richter was a German immigrant, a volunteer in the 56th New York Infantry, a decorated Civil War hero, and a man who formed an intimate relationship with another man. As an immigrant, he was not unique, as nearly 500,000 freshly minted Americans would serve in the Union Army throughout the war. Richter's bravery under fire was impressive, but he was quickly elevated to lieutenant. Richter and Carl Becker praised one another in letters home to their respective families. The relationship lasted after the war. The two men journeyed to California together. They had a falling out over money. Richter eventually married a sharecropper's daughter and farmed to supplement his Civil War pension. Romantic friendships are one way of understanding these relationships between two same-sex friends, which is often unclear. It includes a wide range from non-physical affection to genuine romantic connections. Since homosexuality was forbidden and outlawed, men who would now identify as gay or bisexual were not often capable of openly communicating or fully comprehending those emotions. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.